for joining our Advent presentation. Vian did not know whether he would be able to join us, and so that's the reason why I'm hosting the presentation. For those of us who attended CTU, Sister Barbara Reid needs no introduction. She is a Dominican sister of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and holds a PhD in biblical studies from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. She is currently the president of Catholic Theological Union and the Karl Stollmeyer Distinguished Professor of New Testament Studies. She has taught at CTU since 1988. She has served as vice president and academic dean from 2009 to 2018 and became president in 2021. She has led many study tours and retreats in the Holy Lands. She is the author of more than a dozen books and numerous articles, most recently At the Table of Holy Wisdom, Global Hunger and Feminist Biblical Interpretation, which was published by Paulist in 2023. Also the 2-volume commentary on the Gospel of Luke that she co-authored with Professor Shelley Matthews in the Wisdom Commentary Series, which was published by Liturgical Press in 2021, for which she also served as general editor. As well, she is one of the general editors for the New Jerome Biblical Commentary for the 21st Century, which was published by Bloomsbury Press in 2022. Please join me in welcoming Sister Barbara Reid.
You need to unmute.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you this morning and to share some reflections on this Advent journey that we began last Sunday. I hope that this will not be too distracting. I had trouble getting online with my computer, and so now I'm using a different device. And thanks for your patience, and hoping that I'll also be able to share my screen so that a few visual images that accompany the verbal reflections may be able to spark our imaginations as we reflect more deeply in this very graced time of Advent. So I'm going to try to share my screen, and hopefully this will work. So I am wondering if you're seeing the power. Are you able to?
Yes, we are.
Oh, wonderful. I'm also going to see if I can't put it into slideshow mode here so that. Are you seeing just the one screen, or are you seeing?
We're seeing the whole thing.
The whole thing on this.
I think you have a slideshow link at the top.
Here we go.
From current.
There we go. How's that now?
That's good.
Okay. Thanks for your patience. This iPad works a little differently than my computer does, and so I'm usually using a different device, but thanks for your patience. So I want to share my reflections in 3 parts with you this morning. First of all, just a few reflections about Advent itself. And then as we're beginning year B, a few reflections about the Gospel of Mark, and that will take us this new liturgical year. And then I'd like to share just a few reflections on the readings for each of the 4 Sundays that we have in Advent this year. So first of all, as we enter into Advent, as you recall, last Sunday, the first the gospel reading was one that admonished us, watch, and wait. And so just to start off with, what are we watching for, and what are we waiting for? And many folks will say, oh, we're waiting for the birth of Jesus. We're waiting for Christmas. But Jesus was born more than 2,000 years ago, and that's not what we're waiting for. I would say that what we're doing is, and others will say, well, we're waiting for the second coming of Christ. Well, I'd like to pose another kind of waiting that's appropriate for us in Advent, and that is a kind of waiting and a kind of watching and listening that's a break in our normal routine. That's watching and waiting for Christ, who's already in our midst, who was already born more than 2,000 years ago, but has never left us, is with us now in a different way than when he was here in the flesh, but he is still with us. And so I'd like to suggest that what we're watching, what we're waiting for, is to be on heightened alert to the ways in which Emmanuel is with us here and now, in this time, in this place. It's a time of a break in our normal routine to listen and to wait and to watch for the ways in which God is present with us, and to do so in a heightened way. There's a little bit of a contradiction or a paradox that this oftentimes is the busiest part of the year for families, all the busy preparations for Christmas. And for those of us in ministry, especially those involved in liturgical ministries, all the busyness of preparing all the liturgies, and how complicated this year when Advent is so short, and the fourth Sunday of Advent is right on the heels of Christmas Day. And so for those in ministry, these are very crunched days in Advent, and yet it's a very great opportunity for us to change our pace, to be able to listen attentively to where God is calling us. Perhaps to carve out space, just even 5 more minutes than usual to our prayer time, to listen and watch and wait. And I would also like to suggest that it's a time for us to prepare as we enter into year B, to shift gears into being able to welcome mystery and awe in our lives, and to resist explanation and be able to embrace mystery and wonder, and to go more deeply into that gift that is offered us in year B. I know you're all very familiar with the Gospel of Mark, the shortest of the Gospels, and the Gospel that is the most fast-paced. Jesus is always immediately going to the next spot. I'd like to invite you to think about, as we start year B, to sit down with the Gospel of Mark and read it through start to finish, if you haven't done that recently. You know, it is so very much different to read the whole story all together than it is to hear it just piecemeal, snippets of it every Sunday as we reflect on portions of the gospel. And so I would like to propose that to understand what Mark is doing throughout this liturgical year, we really need to have the whole story. You need to know you need to see the whole thing in context to be able to make sense of any of the parts of it. You'll remember that a central question in the gospel, and sorry, I realize I put yellow writing on a yellow background, so you can't see it, but you know what that central question is, don't you? It's, who is this? Who is this? all the way through the gospel. And it builds up to a first climax in chapter 8, where Peter gives the correct answer. But then as Jesus starts to elaborate on what kind of Messiah, that he will be a suffering, dying, rising Messiah, the disciples, beginning with Peter, struggle mightily to understand who he can be in that way. And then the second climax comes with the centurion at the cross, who declares when he sees Jesus die, truly this was the Son of God. And so one of the things that in Mark's gospel is this aura of mystery, this aura of secrecy. And Jesus keeps telling people who do identify who he is, don't tell, don't tell. And I'd like to suggest that that isn't what happened literally, but that this is a literary technique of Mark to maintain suspense and mystery throughout the story. And what he's trying to lead us toward, I think, is that you can't understand who Jesus is until you get to the end of the story. If you see just the flashy miracles, that doesn't tell us who he is. It's only with the suffering, dying, and rising that we can begin to grasp who he is. And even when we get to the ending of the story points us back to Galilee, back to the beginning, to go back and reflect again. Not to be going round and round in circles where we never get anywhere, but rather it is a circular gospel, but one that invites us always deeper and deeper and deeper as we ponder anew this gospel that is so full of mystery. It's a gospel in which Jesus is portrayed as very, very human, and that comes really to the fore in the Gethsemane scene. The disciples are also extremely frail. They don't understand in this gospel. They keep on missing the point of what Jesus is saying. But what I love so much about the portrait of the disciples in this gospel is that they're not superhuman beings. They are not perfect. They don't get it and just follow right along, but they struggle all along the way, so much like we do. But the thing that stays with me about the disciples in Mark is that while they failed Jesus, they fail to understand, they're very frail and human, they keep on following nonetheless. At least they follow all the way up to Gethsemane. And then when those disciples, when the three favorites of Jesus fail, then the women take over, and they're there at the end of the story and carry the thread forward. They also, I think, we get a glimpse of how they are in Mark when we go to the fourth Sunday of Advent and we have the Annunciation to Mary, who says yes without having a clue what she's saying yes to, and just trusts God, that God will be faithful and God will bring blessing and hope and goodness from even out of excruciating suffering. When we get to that, oh no, they disappeared. There they are. When we get to the end of the story, we have the women at the tomb. And as you will remember, we think that most biblical scholars think that the gospel ends with verse 8 in chapter 16. I know our Bibles have several other endings beyond that, but we're pretty sure that those came from other hands other than the original evangelist. And so it's a very puzzling ending. As you'll remember, the women go to the tomb. There's a young man dressed in white. That's always a signal for an angelic being. And as Jesus kept telling the disciples all the way through the gospel, don't be afraid, don't be afraid. So the angelic figure says, don't be alarmed. But he tells them Jesus is not there, he's been raised. And tells them to go tell the disciples and Peter that he's going ahead to Galilee. There you will see him. So go back to the beginning, the place of newness and possibility and hope. And then the very strange ending. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
Recording in progress.
Many people think that to do with audio. There we go. Are you hearing okay?
Now we are, yes.
Okay, great. So that last line is very puzzling, and many people think that's the ultimate failure, and that this is really the strangest of all gospels. I would like to say that in verse 8, if we go back and look at the Greek words, so can you dust off your New Testament Greek here? If we look at the words in Greek, traumos kai ekstasis, this is not telling us that they have failed and that they're so terrified that they're paralyzed and can't do anything. But rather, I'd like to propose to you that traumos can be the kind of trembling where you're not overcome so much by terror, but by utter amazement at something that is so beyond words that you cannot even begin to express it. Ecstasis is a taking out of oneself. Being ecstatic literally means that you are outside of yourself, drawn into mystery in a powerful way. And so what I'd like to propose is that we have an image of the women at the ending of the gospel where silence is the only appropriate response to this manifestation of divine power. It draws us into wonder, into mystery, in such a way that no words are possible to explain. It is the appropriate response to such an experience. It reminds me too of the silence at the beginning of creation, before God speaks creation into being, and points us to the mystery and the transcendence of God. We'll pick up on new creation in Sunday number 2 of Advent. And then what I think this ending does, I think it's a very clever ending where the evangelist draws us into having to finish the story ourselves. One way to read it is, if the women don't tell the story, then it's up to us to continue to proclaim the good news that the angel directed them to do. So you're wondering, well, why are we talking about the empty tomb? I thought we were talking about Advent. Well, as I said at the outset, we really can't understand different pieces of the gospel until we see the whole thing in context. So I'd invite you to read the whole gospel at the beginning of this year B, in one sitting if possible, and let yourself be drawn into the mystery, into the wonder. For preachers, not only for this ending of the gospel, but throughout the gospel, I'd invite you to think about, rather than trying to give explanations about this mystery, try to help your congregations enter into awe, wonder, mystery. That kind of movement takes time, and so in Advent, when we try to sit more quietly, watch and wait, enter into contemplation, that's the stance that helps us open ourselves up to wonder and to mystery, and to let ourselves be drawn to whatever God wants to do with us in that mystery and awe and wonder. Help folks to enter into the experience rather than explain what the gospel is saying. Now, one other thing about Mark, as you remember, there are no infancy narratives in Mark. So we're not going to get any recounting of the birth of Jesus in Mark. So what we'll be leading up to is at Christmas Vigil, we'll turn to Matthew for the first 25 verses of Matthew's gospel with the genealogy and Joseph's struggle with being obedient, and then the birth of Jesus. On Christmas midnight, we'll have the beginning of Luke's version of the birth of Jesus in chapter 2, Christmas dawn, the visit of the shepherds, and then Christmas Day, we'll switch over to John's prologue. So that's just a very brief intro to the Gospel of Mark as we begin this new liturgical year. And let's shift now into talking about the Sundays of Advent. So we already began last Sunday, and you've already begun your reflection on the first Sunday's readings, the reading from Isaiah, from 1 Corinthians, and from Mark 13. Now, Mark 13 is from the apocalyptic chapter of Mark. So Jesus and the disciples are sitting on the Mount of Olives, and they're talking about the end times. And then Jesus tells a little parable in chapter 13 that we heard last Sunday. 4 times he says to them, be watchful, be alert, don't be caught unaware. He uses the metaphor about a master leaving and then coming back unexpectedly. And in that parable, though, there's an image that's rather it's rather frightening. It seems to be calling for an anxious watching, servants not wanting to be caught unaware, and I'm not sure that is the stance. Well, let me just say, I don't know so much that that's the stance that we're invited to stay, is, be anxious and be sure you're doing it all well. I think of that image of Santa and the song that says, you better watch out because Santa's watching and keeping track of everything. And I think that's not the kind of watching that the gospel is inviting us into. It's more the watching and waiting eagerly for the revelation of the Christ. And I want to suggest in our midst already. The watching for how is Emmanuel working in our midst right now and revealing himself to us in our midst right now. So not waiting in dread for some angry master that's going to come back and hopefully not find us wanting, but attentive listening for the familiar footstep of the returning beloved or the already present beloved. We wouldn't want to be found sleeping, but to be ready with arms wide open. I think, for example, of parents when they have teenage children that go out at night. And I know my mother never slept until I was back in the house. It's that listening, watching, waiting, being alert for the footsteps of one that's so beloved that you're eager and willing and waiting to welcome them. I think too of the powerful amount of listening that has been going on in our church with the synod. I think about what hard work we've been doing, those of us who've been participating in synodal listening sessions, and especially for our representatives who were there in Rome for the month of October. It's that kind of listening with eager attentiveness, not knowing necessarily how what the result of the listening is going to be, but to watch and wait in trust and with as open a heart as we possibly can have. We're not so very good, and most of us in US culture are not so very good at waiting. We find it really difficult, most of us, and we try to eliminate it as much as possible. We want fast food, express lines, speedy internet, and that's hard for us to wait and watch for God's timing. I want to suggest too that watching and waiting, though, is not it's not dead time. It's not that nothing is happening. It's like one of the images we get in Advent, the farmer awaiting for the soil, the seed to germinate in the soil and then to sprout and grow, or women who are pregnant, waiting and waiting for the new life to emerge. I think of Advent as pregnant waiting. It is not fallow or dead time. There's very active work going on of bringing forth and preparing for new life. I love the image that Paul gives us in the second reading to the Thessalonians, where he says that we have the power to accomplish what is the work that we've been given to do. Sorry, it was the Corinthians that he was writing to that first Sunday. And he reminded them and us that we lack no spiritual gift as we wait for the revelation of Christ. And so claiming that gift, of that power to accomplish what God wants to do in us and in our faith communities and in our ministries. I think about the contrast, though, between the kind of power that the author of Isaiah wants to see from God. In that first reading from Isaiah, they pray that God would rend the heavens and come down, with mountains quaking before him. So they want God to show divine power through awesome deeds. And in some ways that corresponds to what the disciples like and expect in the first part of the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is doing all these deeds of power, and they want God to do awesome deeds so that it would be crystal clear that God is God, and it would compel people to believe. But the contrast is that is exactly not how God acts in our world and in our lives. And so all of what Advent is inviting us to reflect on is how God's immense love comes in the form of a vulnerable child. So God hasn't ruptured the heavens and come down shaking mountains, but God has ruptured the dividing line between divinity and humanity by taking on human flesh in Christ. And so not only by becoming one with us, it also has a flip side that then we likewise are called to embody the Christ in our world. So Advent invites us to reflect more deeply on how we do that, and also to watch for Christ's presence in each one we meet, especially those who are the most needy. In that first reading, Isaiah is addressing the returned exiles, and they lament, all of us have become like unclean people. All our good deeds are like polluted rags. We have all withered like leaves, and our gifts and our guilt carries us away like the wind. You'll notice that in that reading, Israel is blaming itself for the exile, blaming their own sinfulness for what has happened. Now that's an image of God that I would invite us to reconsider. I don't think God is punishing, but that is how Israel interprets what has happened to themselves. But God is now bringing them safely out of Babylon, and now they're entering into the daunting work of reconstruction, creating the temple, rebuilding their lives in Jerusalem, but everything has been destroyed. Their economic resources are very puny. And so one of the images we have for God at the end of that Isaiah reading, and maybe you focused on this in your own prayer and preaching this past weekend, was that Israel is not able by its own means to reshape the inner and outer muck of their lives. They have to give themselves over to the divine potter. And they say, we are the clay, you are the potter, we are the work of your hands. And so that beautiful image of the potter is one that can help us reflect on whatever the muck of our lives is, whatever the mud and muck of our lives is, both individually and collectively. The divine potter is the one who can reshape us into a beautiful receptacle that is open and waiting for all of the gifts that God is able to accomplish. And I think that is really what incarnation is God comes into the mud and the muck of our lives, and into the messiness of human lives. And God is able to reshape us anew through the grace of God with us, God among us. You know, at the beginning, when we're hearing that we need to be watchful and waiting, it's in the end, we see that it's God who's faithful and watchful. As Paul will tell the Corinthians, it's God who will shepherd us and give us strength. It's God who's the vine dresser who will tend the vineyard, as the responsorial psalm said last Sunday. And so how we can collaborate with God who is trying to hollow out space for us to be attentive to the gifts that God wants to give us. God will be the one who remolds us. And if we can give ourselves over to openness and receptivity to what God is trying to do with us. Let me move now to the second Sunday, where we have a strong theme throughout the readings for the second week of God able to do something new with us, of a new creation, fresh beginnings. And so the image in Isaiah this coming Sunday is a very tender image. The Isaiah is saying to the exiles that there is hope for a new beginning, as God will speak tenderly to Jerusalem, and God literally is going to speak to Jerusalem's heart. This is the language of lovers, and it is a message of comfort that Isaiah is giving to the weary exiles, and talking about a way forged through the desert back home to Jerusalem. And the prophet speaks of God's strong arm, the strong arm of the Holy One, not one that's punishing because of their guilt, but one that has the strength to gather up all the lambs and hold them close to God's breast, gently leading them home. And so the image of God's power in the first reading for this Sunday is that of a tender shepherd that holds close all those who feel broken and vulnerable, and leading them out of the desert places and guiding them along God's way. This image, I was just in Greece and Turkey earlier this fall in October, and we were driving along the road, and all of a sudden, a big flock of sheep and goats was crossing the road in front of us, and we had to stop and wait for them to go. But out the side of the window, there was this one shepherd girl with a lamb that I'm glad one of our participants captured the image, and this young shepherd was to me so embodied what the first reading for this Sunday is giving us, that image of God. So one thing I might invite you to is, when you hear the image of God as shepherd, think not only of male shepherds like Moses and David, but think too of the female shepherds, both then and now. Ruth, for example, was a shepherd. So just expanding our imagination a little bit. I think too, as we look at the imagery of new creation that is emerging in this gospel, it's that God can remake. The second reading talks about a newness in terms of a new heaven and a new earth. So this is Second Peter, is talking about God being able to create something new. And Mark's gospel will begin, this is the beginning of the good news. So we'll get the first 8 verses of Mark's gospel on this second Sunday. One of the things, though, that there are a number of places throughout the Bible where there is talk about a new creation. But one of the things you'll see in Second Peter that is a little different is that Second Peter envisions a fiery consummation and destruction of the whole of creation before the coming of the new. Now that's an old notion that originated in Persia and then spread to the Greco-Roman world. But and sometimes we may think that, oh, if God would just wipe it all out and start all over again. But the good news of the gospel is that God is doing something even more dramatic and continues to make dramatic transformations, not with fiery conflagration, but trying to break open hardened hearts as we let ourselves be held in God's bosom and let ourselves be open to Jesus's purifying love. And it's by those rather ordinary, although that could feel extraordinary, means that holy wisdom is transforming our existing world into a new creation, into a new world. It also makes me think that there's room for us to ponder how we treat our current created world, and to pay attention, as Pope Francis has so strongly urged us to care for the creation that we already have, and how God is renewing and transforming creation in our midst. But one of the things that Second Peter will also talk about is the delay of this newness that has been promised. And it's not that God is taking God's time, but it's we who sometimes dawdle. You know, some of us, we can open up to God's love in a twinkling. Others, it takes a very, very long time. And so in the second reading, Second Peter assures us that divine reality, one day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like a day. And what I think he's trying to say to us is that God will give enough time so that everybody has time to accept the transforming love of God. And that it's not God that is taking God's time, but we're taking our time. So God can't bring about the new creation without our response. And so while God wants to bring about new beginnings, it won't happen if we won't open ourselves up to it and collaborate with God in bringing forth the new creation that God is doing. The first and second readings also invite us into desert space to do this. Now, in scripture, desert space is ambivalent. It's both a place of terror and emptiness, and at the same time, it can be a hollowed out space for grace. So we think about, for example, the struggles that Israel had in the desert and the difficulty that Israel had being faithful during desert times. It can be a place of tempting and trial, and we remember Jesus's temptation in the desert. But it's also a place where we can be stripped of everything that distracts us from God's love, and to enter into knowing ourselves as deeply, deeply loved, and always with the ability to begin again. I think about Hosea's invitation, where God says in chapter 2 of Hosea, to speak to lure, God will lure her out into the desert, and there I will speak to her heart. And so the desert being a place where we can be stripped of anything that is in the way of listening and watching for God's love for us. There's 2 feasts also that intervene in these first 2 weeks of Advent. So this Friday, the Immaculate Conception, and a week from Tuesday, Our Lady of Guadalupe. And these 2 are beautiful images inviting us to enter into the way that the Mother of Jesus can draw us into appreciating the liberating love that God extends to us, and helping us to be pregnant with hope as Mary was. I think of what a powerful image Guadalupe is for God's unconditional love and solidarity with the poorest and the least powerful, and helping people who lived in a conquered, colonized world of degradation, of God's intent to restore all to dignity and to a place of freedom, and God's maternal care for us that's so palpably present in these images that we have of Mary that we celebrate in these early weeks of Advent. When we get to the third Sunday, Gaudete Sunday, of course, you know that the readings are permeated with rejoicing and delight and joy, in the joy of the exiles returning to Jerusalem in the first reading, the rejoicing of Mary in the Magnificat in the responsorial psalm, and Paul's insistence to the Thessalonians in the second reading, and to us, that we rejoice at every moment. And I think what's notable in each of these readings is that joy is not just a vague sentiment or an abstract concept, but it's something that wells up in us in response to very concrete signs of God's providential care for us. In Isaiah, the very concrete signs of God's care are in healing broken hearts, liberty for all who are captives, release for those imprisoned. And then Jesus claims that same mission for his own in Luke 4, as you remember, as he declares his mission. I can't help but think when we hear liberty for all who are captive and release for those imprisoned, I can't help but think in our own day, the hostages, the Israeli hostages in Gaza and other foreign nationals, and the Palestinian prisoners released, and how desperately our prayer goes to those who are suffering in this current war. I think two of the beautiful opportunities that the responsorial psalm gives us on the third Sunday, it's taken from Mary's Magnificat, and her rejoicing that's caused not only by God's mysterious working in her own life, but by the way God has been working in the lives of her people all through Israel's history. And she recounts all the ways in which God's mercy has been manifest in every generation. And so for us to take that stance of rejoicing in God's mercy, remembering that everything begins with God's love and God's mercy extended to us, and then how we respond to that by paying it forward, it's the whole dynamic that God is wanting to do with us. And she sings about filling up the hungry with good things. And I think of how many still in our world are suffer hunger and food shortages, in contrast to so many who have more than enough to eat. And what will it take for us to level out all those inequities in our day? I think as I hear the line in verse 52 of the Magnificat, I think too that Mary is not hoping that we will have a reversal of the way things were. In other words, take the ones that were on top and put them on the bottom and the bottom up on top now. But rather that I think she's envisioning a two-way movement, that those who have power, privilege, and status, and more than enough, need to, as they open their hands, let go, and a downward movement, if you will, and an upward movement for those who are on the bottom of the heap, the most humiliated, the most oppressed, who are raised up then, so that it's a two-way movement of a letting go and a lifting up that will bring both together in a leveling that will have all of us at equal places, with equal places at the table. If we go back to Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, the second reading, for a moment, he tells the Thessalonians to do three very concrete things. And he tells them to do this constantly. He tells them to rejoice, pray, and give thanks, no matter what the circumstances. I find that a really compelling invitation in Advent time, is that our joy and our rejoicing and our giving thanks and our praying in thanksgiving is not dependent on things going well, but rather that we are to take that stance all the time, which helps us to let go any sense of entitlement that we may have, any sense that we're owed gifts from God or anyone else. So taking a stance of gratitude is a time that allows us to embody the joy and delight that God constantly takes in us. One last reflection on that third Sunday is that we'll find in the gospel that John the Baptist will be out in the desert proclaiming, "Make straight the way." It's the gospel that day will come from John's prologue, and it is the Johannine equivalent of Mark's constant question, "Who are you?" And John will say, he's not the anointed one, he's not the Messiah, he's not the long-awaited one, but he's pointing to the expected one. He'll say he's not the light, but he's pointing to the light. And so that provides us with one more image on that third Sunday of how we too are witnesses to the light that is already in our midst. But we are not the light, but we are witnesses to the light. We point to the light and let the Christ illumine all of our lives. Briefly, a few reflections on the fourth Sunday. The fourth Sunday, we'll find it starts out with a reading from 2 Samuel rather than Isaiah this time. And In 2 Samuel, King David is finally free from all of his wars and can devote his energy to, first of all, he wants to build a beautiful palace for himself and then a splendid temple for God. And at first, the prophet Nathan thinks that's an okay plan. But then he hears a word from God that turns that plan upside down. And God says, should you build me a house to dwell in? And God explains then that all the success that David has had is God's doing. And it now culminates in God establishing a house that is a dynasty for David. Now there's a play on the word house here, as it shifts in meaning from David's palace to God's temple, then to the Davidic ruling line. So there's a little bit of a wordplay there on house. But one of the things that we would see if we had the omitted verses 6 and 7 from 2 Samuel 7 is that God objects, that God never asked any of the leaders to build a temple. God says, I've not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I've been moving about in a tent and a tabernacle. So one of the images we get from that first reading is that God's always been on the move, dwelling with the Israelites in the same way they themselves have lived, in a makeshift tent. And so the connection, I think, with Advent is that God then takes up residence in human flesh, not a magnificent palace or temple, but in the most vulnerable of human beings. And those who are least impressive by human standards are the most favored by God when it comes to revealing God's mysteries. So David, you remember, was the youngest, the least qualified. Mary, an ordinary young woman making wedding plans in an insignificant town in the Galilee when she was asked to take on a seemingly impossible task. So in both the first reading and the gospel, there's a startling twist. It's not we who make dwelling places for God, but God who builds the house. And so then once again, we'll find ourselves confronting the invitation. What's our reception to that word that wants to dwell within us? How will we receive the Christ as a lowly child? And how will we receive him in all the ones that seem most insignificant in our own lives around us? I'm going to skip ahead a little bit so that I say something about Mary. Mary, the second reading, the gospel reading will be the Annunciation. And again, we have an image of a young woman who is not at all given what the end will be, but who's asked to say yes in a very messy situation. And yet out of that messy situation, God will bring forth blessing, holiness, salvation. And she will say yes without knowing how God will accomplish that. She will be given the assurance that the Holy Spirit will help her accomplish it. And perhaps that is exactly what we need to rely on too. Mary has a unique role, but we too are asked by God to make a dwelling place within ourselves and within our world for the Christ. And the circumstances will always be messy. But what God asks is for us to say yes, even to what we know not, what we're saying yes. Mary will say yes, just as Samuel did. And I think this is part of why we have 2 Samuel instead of Isaiah for our first reading on that fourth Sunday, connecting Samuel's yes with Mary's yes. And also the reminder that while most of our images of the Annunciation have Mary all by herself with Gabriel, I love this painting by Sister Blandina, Pauline Blandina, who's a Dominican sister of Sparkhill, who paints Mary with her whole family hearing the Annunciation, from the angel there to the right of her, and that it's a communal affair, a family affair, not an individual affair, as God with us always has been a whole community affair. You'll notice the resemblance to Mary's Magnificat, to Hannah's prayer, and again, the connection with Samuel. Let me just conclude by saying that the predominant invitation in Advent is always one into hope, never to give in to despair, no matter what the circumstances, no matter how difficult it may be, to see God bringing light and joy and peace out of very troubled situations. The invitation in Advent is to keep hope alive, not only for ourselves, but for all of the communities of faith and all of the individuals whom we accompany during the Advent journey. I hope that some of these images and reflections help enrich your Advent time this year. And I'd like to pause now and ask you if you would like to make some comments or ask any questions. I'm going to try to stop sharing my screen. And now I can see all of you. I hope you can see one another as well. So if you have a comment or question, if you want to either wave at us or use the raise the hand feature or the chat, if you have a few more minutes, we can chat together if you'd like.
Just a reminder that the raise hand function is under reactions, which you may find in the more section on your screen. If you're on a tablet, tap the center of the screen to see the tools. If you're on a desktop or laptop, just move your mouse to see the tools at the bottom.
Thank you, Kathleen. I can see you've already entered into the deep contemplative silence.
Barbara, can you hear me? No? Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
This is Bob Bossy. I'm in Chicago. Thank you for your reflection. It stirred up a lot of different thoughts in me. I have, just the different thoughts that came to my mind. One was in the end of Mark's gospel that you were referring to, the first 8 verses of 16. One of the commentators that I'm sort of favorite of is he alluded to the fact that Mark, rather the angel, encourages the people to go back to Galilee and to restart their ministry, because that's where it began. So it's not focusing upon their brokenness and failure, but a new beginning, which I think comports with a lot of what you said. And the second thing that I was thinking when you were reflecting, and I was very glad that you brought up the Israeli-Palestinian situation. I was thinking of something I have on my wall from Oscar Romero, and it talks about basically shining the light of the gospel on the current world events, and if it doesn't disturb us, then what kind of a gospel is that? And so I was thinking, amidst all of the horrific bombing that is going on the Palestinian people, I was trying to say, what would my care of or reflection about the Advent in light of maybe just trying to save my life and that of my children? I don't have an answer for that. It's just I think I'm forced by my previous words to ask myself that question. How is the light of the gospel help in circumstances like that? And then the last thing I wanted to say was, I always think, I guess I'm stereotypical like everyone else, and that is that I think all the people in Gaza are Muslim. And the times that I've spent in Israel and Gaza and the West Bank, I know that people there are also Christian. So it's just a different perspective, you know. So thank you for your words. It gave me a lot to think about. I got about 6 homilies out of it. So thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Great. Hung, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, sister. Yeah, so I just have some comments on your talk about that. Usually for me that during Christmas, and then I rather to focus solely on Christmas reading solely. But as you mentioned that if I can read like the whole Gospel of Mark in one setting, and then so I'm wondering about the connection of the incarnation when you mentioned about the incarnation, is how to related to SCJ spirituality about the oblation and reparation, and also based on Mary Fiat. So the SG venue become flesh, and then that's the first dynamic of incarnation, and also that the twofold aspect of dynamic by respond by Mary when she said, SG Ancilla, let it be done to me according to your word. And that also is very close to SCJ spirituality. So the SC venue is not complete without a response by saying yes. So that way, the Christmas is not complete also for me if we are not by saying yes. When you mentioned about the incarnation, about the mud, right? And then with the human hand, with the vulnerable, and then we can create a mark. So that way, the Christmas continue to leading us to continue, it not only to stop at the Christmas. So that way, for me, that connected to the whole year, that Echivino, and also that reparation, the redamatio, a return of love for a return of love for love. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Hung. Thank you very much. Any other comments?
I want to thank you, Barbara, for taking this time with us this morning. In the midst of the busyness of this time of the year, you remind us to take time to enter into the awe and mystery of these Advent days and readings. May this prompt within us a watching and waiting for the coming of the Lord in the here and now. May these days give us as individuals and as a community possibilities to help others experience God's loving care and presence. I also want to thank you, Vian, for making the arrangements for this period of reflection. Thank you to Kathleen, Sister Kathleen, for providing technical assistance. And finally, thank you all for taking advantage of this time together. May we continue to carry each other in prayer during these holy days. Together we rejoice, pray, and give thanks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jack. And if it would be helpful to you, I'll send a copy of the images on the PowerPoint to Jack and Bien, and to share with you if you find any of those images helpful to pray with in these Advent days ahead. So thank you all for this opportunity, and many blessings in this year when you're celebrating your centennial.
Thank you.